Outside the Monterey County Courthouse in Salinas, California, the downtown merchants' Christmas decorations glittered in the thin sunlight that makes the winter lettuce grow. Inside, the crowd blinked uneasily in the blinding television lights. The occasion was a meeting of the Monterey County Board of Supervisors, and the issue on this warm afternoon before the Christmas 1965 was whether or not a small school in Carmel Valley, the Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, owned by Mrs. Joan Diaz, was in violation of Section 32C of the Monterey County Zoning Code, which prohibits land use detrimental to the peace, morals, or general welfare of Monterey County. Miss General Peckus, who lived across the road from the school, had put the problem another way. We wonder what kind of people would go to a school like this, she asked quite early in the controversy. Why they aren't out working and making money. Miss Pickus was a plump young matron with an air of bewildered determination, and she came to the rostrum in a strawberry pink knit dress to say that she had been plagued by people associated with Miss Baez's school coming up to ask where it was, although they knew perfectly well where it was. One gentleman I remembered had a beard. Well, I don't care, Miss Peckus cried, when someone in the front row giggled. I have 3 small children. That's a big responsibility, and I don't like to have to worry about. Miss Peckus paused delicately. About who's around? The hearing lasted from 2 until 7:15 p.m., 5 hours and 15 minutes of participatory democracy during which it was suggested on the one hand that Monterey County Board of Supervisors was turning our county into Nazi Germany, and on the other that the presence of Miss Baez and her 15 students in Carmel Valley would lead to a Berkeley type demonstrations, demoralized trainees at Fort Ord, paralyzed army convoys using the Carmel Road, and send property values plummeting throughout the county. Frankly, I can't conceive of anyone buying property near such an operation, declared Miss Peckus's husband, who is a veterinarian. Both Dr. and Mrs. Peckus, the latter near tears, said that they were particularly offended by Miss Baez's presence on her property during the weekends. It seemed that she did not always stay inside. She sat out under trees and walked around the property. We don't start until 1, someone from the school objected, even if we did make noise, which we don't. The Pickus could sleep until 1. I don't see what the problem is. The Pittis lawyer jumped up. The problem is that the Pittacus happen to have a very beautiful swimming pool. They like to have guests out on weekends, like to use the pool. They'd have to stand up on the table to see the school. They will too, shouted a young woman who had already indicated the approval of Miss Baez by reading aloud the supervisors a passage from Joan Stuart Mill's on Liberty. They'll be out with spyglasses. That is not true, Miss Peckus keened. We'll see the school out of 3 bedroom windows out of the living room window. It's the only direction we can look. Miss Baez sat very still in the front row. She was wearing a long-sleeved navy blue dress with an Irish lace collar, cuffs, and she kept her hands folded in her lap. She's extraordinary looking, far more so than her photographs suggest. Since the camera seems to emphasize an Indian cast to her features and fails to record either the startling fineness or clarity of her bones in her eyes, her most striking characteristics, her absolute directness, her absence of guile. She has a great natural style, and she is what used to be called a lady. Scum, hissed an old man with a snap on bow tie, who had identified himself as a veteran of 2 wars, and who is a regular at such meetings. Spaniel. He seemed to be referring to the length of Miss Baez's hair, and was trying to get her attention by tapping with his walking stick. But her eyes did not flicker from the rostrum. After a while she got up, and stood until the room was completely quiet. Her opponent sat tense, ready to spring up and counter whatever defense she was planning to make of her politics, of her school, of beards, of Berkeley-type demonstrations, and disorder in general. Everybody's talking about their $40,000 and $50,000 houses and their property values going down, she drawled finally, keeping her voice low and gazing levelly at the supervisors. I'd just like to say one thing. I have more than $100,000 invested in the Carmel Valley. I'm interested in protecting my property too. The property owner smiled disingenuously at Dr. and Mrs. Peckus then, and took her seat amid the complete silence. She's an interesting girl. A girl who might have interested Henry James at about the time he did Vernon Terrence. The Bostonian's Joan Baez grew up in a more evangelicalist thicket of middle class, the daughter of a Quaker physics teacher and the granddaughter of two Protestant ministers, an English Scottish Episcopalian on her mother's side, a Mexican Methodist on her father's. She was born on Staten Island but raised on the edges of the academic community all over the country until she found Carmel. She did not really come from anywhere. When it was time to go to high school, her father was teaching at Stanford, and so she went to Palo Alto High School, where she taught herself House of the Rising Sun on a Sears Roebuck guitar, tried to achieve a vibrato by tapping her throat with her fingers, and made headlines by refusing to leave school during a bomb drill. When it was time for her to go to college, her father was at MIT and Harvard, and she went a month to Boston University, dropped out, and for a long while sang in coffee bars around Harvard Square. She did not much like the Harvard Square life. They just lie in their pads, smoking pot, and do stupid things like that, said the ministry's granddaughter of her acquaintances there. But she did not yet know another. In the summer of 1959, a friend took her to the first Newport Folk Festival. She arrived in Newport in a Cadillac hearse, with Joan Baez painted on the side, sang a few songs to 13,000 people, and there it was, a new life. Her first album sold more copies than the work of any other female folk singer in record history. By the end of 1961, Vanguard had released her second album, and her total sales were behind those of only Harry Belafonte, the Kingston Trio, and the Weavers. She had finished her first long tour and given a concert in Carnegie Hall, which was sold out 2 months in advance, and had turned down $100,000 worth of concert dates because she would only work a few months a year. She was the right girl at the right time. She had only a small repertory of child ballads. What's Joan still doing with Mary Hampton? Bob Dylan would fret later. Never trained her pure soprano and annoyed some purists because she was indifferent to the origins of her material and sang everything sad. But she rode in with the folk wave just as it was cresting. She could reach an audience in a way that neither the purist nor the more commercial folk singers seemed to be able to do. If her interest was never in the money, neither was it really in the music. She was interested instead in something that went on between her and the audience. The easiest kind of relationship for me is one with 10,000 people, she said. The hardest is with one. She did not want, then or ever, to entertain. She wanted to move people, to establish with them some communion of emotion. By the end of 1963, she had found, in the protest movement, something upon which she could focus the emotion. She went into the South, she sang in Negro colleges, and she was always there where the barricade was. Selma, Montgomery, Birmingham. She sang at the Lincoln Memorial after the March on Washington. She told the International Revenue Service that she did not intend to pay the 60% of her income tax that was calculated went to the defense establishment. She became the voice that meant protest, although she would always maintain a curious distance from the movement's more ambiguous moments. I got pretty sick of those southern marches after a while, she would say later. All of those big entertainers renting little planes and flying down, always about 35,000 people in town. She had recorded only a handful of albums, but she had seen her face on the cover of Times. She was just 22. Joan Baez was a personality before she was entirely a person, and like anyone to whom that happens, she is, in a sense, the helpless victim of what others have seen in her, written about her, wanted her to be and not be. The roles assigned to her are various, but variations on a single theme. She is the Madonna of the disaffected. She is the pawn of the protest movement. She is the unhappy adolescent. She is the singer who would not train her voice, the rebels who drives the jaguar too fast, the Rima who hides the birds and the deer. Above all, she is the girl who feels things, who has hung on to the freshness and pain of adolescence, the girl ever wounded, ever young, now at an age when the wounds begin to heal, whether one wants them to or not. Joan Baez rarely leaves Carmel Valley. Although all Baez's activities tend to take on certain ominous overtones, in the collective consciousness of Monterey County, what actually goes on at Miss Baez's Institute for the Study of Nonviolence, which was allowed to continue operating in the Carmel Valley by a 3-2 vote of supervisors, is so apparently ingenious as to disarm even veterans of two wars who wear snap on bow ties. 4 days a week, Miss Baez and her 15 students meet at the school for lunch. Potato salad, Kool-Aid, and hot dogs broiled on a portable barbecue. After lunch, they do ballet exercises to the Beatles record, and after that, they sit around on the bare floor beneath a photo mural of Cypress Point and discuss their reading Gandhi on Nonviolence, Louis Fischer's Life on Muhammad Gandhi, Jeremy Frank's Breaking the Thought Barrier, Thoreau's On Civil Disobedience, Krishnamurti's The First and Last Freedom, and Think on These Things, See Right, Mill's The Power Elite, Huxley's Ends and Means, and Marshall McLean's Understanding Media. On the fifth day, they meet as usual, but spend the afternoon in total silence, which involves not only not talking, but also not reading, not writing, and not smoking. Even on discussion days, the silence is invoked for regular 20-minute or hour intervals, a regimen described by one of the students as invaluable for clearing your mind of personal hang-ups, and by Miss Baez as just about the most important thing about the school. There is no admission requirements, other than that applicants must be at least 18 years old. Admission to each session is only granted to the first 15 who write and ask to come. They come from all over, and they are on average very young, very earnest, and not very much in touch with the larger scene. Less refugees from it than children who do not quite apprehend it. They worry a great deal about responding to one another with beauty and tenderness, and their responses to one another is in fact so tender that an afternoon at the school tends to drift perilously into the never never, the debate whether or not it was a wise tactic for Vietnam Day committee at Berkeley to try to reason with Hell's Angels on the hip level. Okay, someone argues. So the angels just shrug and say, are things violence? How can the VDC guy answer that? They discuss a proposal from Berkeley for an international nonviolent army. The idea is we go to Vietnam and we go into these villages, and then if they burn them, we burn too. It has a beautiful simplicity, someone says. Most of them are too young to have been around for the memorable events of protest, and the few who have been active tell those stories to those who have not. Stories which begin one night in Scranton, or recently when we were sitting in at AEC, and we had this 11-year-old on the Canada to Cuba march who was at the time corresponding with a Gandhian. And they talk about Allen Ginsberg, the only one, the only beautiful voice, the only one talking. Geisenberg had suggested that the VDC send women carrying babies and flowers to Oakland Army Terminal. Babies and flowers, a pretty little girl breathes, but that's so beautiful. That's the whole point. Geisenberg was down here one weekend, recalls a dreamy boy with curly, golden hair. He brought a copy of the Fuck Song Bag, but we burned it. He giggles. He is holding a clear violet marble up to the window, turning it in the sunlight. Joan gave it to me, he says, one night at her house when we all had a party and gave each other presents. It was like Christmas, but it wasn't. The school itself is an old whitewashed adobe house, quite far out among the yellow hills and dusty scrub oaks of the upper Carmel Valley. All-landers support a torn wire fence around the school. There is no sign, no identification at all. The adobe was a one-room county school until 1950. After that, it was occupied in turn by the So Help Me Hannah Poison Oak Remedy Laboratory and a small shotgun shell manufacturing business, two enterprises which apparently did not present a threat to property values that Miss Baez does. The $120 fee paid by each student for the 6-week session includes lodging at an apartment house in Pacific Grove and does not meet the school's expensive. Ms. Baez not only has a $40,000 investment in the school's property, but is responsible as well for the salary of Ira Sandpearl, who is the president of the institution, the leader of the discussions, and in fact the immense guise of the entire project. You might think we're starting in a very small way. Ira Sandpearl says. Sometimes the smallest things can change the course of history. Look at the Benedictine order. Anyway, it is impossible to talk about Joan Baez without talking about Ira Sandpearl. One of the men on the planning commission said, I was being led down the primrose path by the lunatic fringe. Miss Baez giggles. Ira said, maybe he's the lunatic and his beard's the fringe. Ira Sandpearl is a 42-year-old native of St. Louis who has, besides the beard, a shaved head, a large nuclear disarmament emblem on his corduroy jacket, glittering in the slightly menacing eyes, a high cracked laugh, and the general look of a man who has all his life followed some impracticability but fatally askew rainbows. He has spent a good deal of time in the Pacific movements around San Francisco, Berkeley, and Palo Alto, and was, at the time, and Miss Baez hit up the idea of the Institute working in the Palo Alto bookstore. Ira Sandpearl first met Joan Baez when she was 16 and was brought by her father to a Quaker meeting in Palo Alto. There was something magic, something different about her even then, he recalls. I remember once she was singing at a meeting where I was speaking. The audience was so responsive that night that I said, Honey, when you grow up, we'll have to be an evangelical team. He smiles and spreads his hands. The two became close, according to Iris Sandpearl. After Miss Baez's father went to live in Paris as a UNESCO advisor, I was the oldest friend around, so naturally she turned to me. He was with her at the time of Berkeley's demonstrations in the fall of 1964. We were actually outside agitators you heard so much about, he says. Basically, we wanted to turn an unviolent movement into a nonviolent one. Joan was enormously instrumental in pulling the movement out of its slump, although the boys may not admit to it now. A month or so after her appearance at Berkeley, Joan Baez talked to Ira Sandpearl about the possibility of tutoring her for a year. She found herself among politically knowledgeable people, he said, and while she had strong feelings, she didn't know any of the socio-economic political history terms of nonviolence. It was all vague, she interrupts, nervously brushing her hair back. I want it to be less vague. They decided to make it not a year's private tutorial, but a school to go on indefinitely, and enrolled the first students late in the summer of 1965. The Institute aligns itself with no movements. Some of the kids are just leading us into another long, big, violent mess, Miss Baez says. And there is, in fact, a marked distrust of most activist organizations. Ira Sandpearl, for example, had little use of the VDC because the VDC believed in nonviolence only as a limited tactic, accepted conventional power blocks, and even ran one of its leaders for Congress, which is anathema to Sandpearl. Darling, let me put it in this way. In civil rights, now the president signs a bill. Who does he call to witness it? Adam Powell? No. He calls Rustin, Farmer, King. None of them. In the conventional power structure, he pauses, as if envisioning a day when he and Miss Baez will be called upon to witness the signing of a bill outlawing violence. I'm not optimistic, darling, but I'm hopeful. There's a difference. I'm hopeful. The gas heater sputters on and off, and Miss Baez watches it in her duffel coat, draws up around her shoulders. Everybody says I'm politically naive, and I am, she says after a while. It is something she says frequently to people she does not know. So, are we the people running politics, or we wouldn't be in wars, would we? The door opens, and a short, middle-aged man wearing handmade sandals walks in. He is Manuel Greenhill, Miss Baez's manager, and although he has been her manager for 5 years, he has never visited the Institute, and he has never before met Ira Sandpearl. At last, Ira Sandpearl cries, jumping up. The disembodied voice on the telephone is here at last. There is Manny Greenhill. There is Ira Sandpearl. Here I am. Here's the villain. It is difficult to arrange to see Joan Baez, at least for anyone not tuned to the underground circuits of protest movements. The New York company for which she records Vanguard will only give Manny Greenhill's number in Boston. Try area code 415 prefix DA for number 4321. Manny Greenhill will rasp. Area code 415 DA 4-4321 will connect the caller with Cobblestone's bookstore in Palo Alto, which is where Ira Sandpearl used to work. Someone at that bookstore will take a number, and after checking it with Carmel to see if anyone there cares to hear from the caller, will call back, dislocating a caramel number. The caramel number is not, as one might think by now, for Miss Baez, but for an answering service. The service will take a number, and after some days or weeks, a call may or may not be received by Judy Flint, Miss Baez's secretary. Miss Flint says that she will try to connect Miss Baez. I don't see people, she says, at the heart of curiously improved web of the wrong numbers, disconnected telephones, and unreturned calls. I lock the gate and hope nobody comes, but they will come anyway. Somebody's been telling them where I live. She lives quietly, she reads, and she talks to the people who have been told where she lives. And occasionally, Iris Sandpearl, go to San Francisco to see friends and talk about the peace movement. She sees her two sisters, and she sees Iris Sandpearl. She believes that her days in the Institute talking and listening to Iris Sandpearl are bringing her closer to contentment than anything she has done so far. Certainly than the singing. I used to stand up there and think, I'm getting so many thousands of dollars for what? She is defensive about her income. Oh, I have some money from somewhere, vague about her plans. There are some things I want to do. I want to try some rock and roll and some classic music, but I'm not going to start worrying about the charts and sales, because then where are you? Exactly where she wants to be seems an open question, bewildering to her and even more so to her manager. If he is asked what his most celebrated client is doing now and plans to do in the future, Manny Greenhill talks about lots of plans, other areas, and her own choice. Finally, he hits upon something. Listen, she just did a documentary for Canadian television variety. Give it a great review. Let me read you. Manny Greenhill reads, let's see, here the variety says planned only a 20-minute interview, but when CBC officials in Toronto saw the film, they decided to go with a special. He interrupts himself. That's pretty newsworthy right there. Let's see now. Here they quote her ideas on peace. You know those? Here she says, every time I go to Hollywood, I want to throw up. Let's not get into that. Here now, he impersonates of Ringo Starr and George Harrison or Dead On. Get that, that's good. Manny Greenhill is hoping to get Miss Baez to write a book, to be in a movie, and not to go around recording the rock and roll songs. He will not discuss her income, although he will say, at once jaunty and bleak, but there won't be much of it this year. Miss Baez let him schedule only one concert for 1966, down from an average of 30 a year, has accepted only one regular club booking in her entire career, and is virtually never on television. What's she going to do on Andy Williams? Manny Greenhill shrugs. One time she sang of the Pat Boone songs with him, he adds, which proves she can get along. But still, we don't want her up there with some dance routines behind her. Greenhill keeps an eye on her political appearances and tries to prevent the use of her name. We say if they use her name, it's a concert. The point is, if they haven't used her name, then if she doesn't like the looks of it, she can get out. He is reassigned to the schools, cutting into her schedule. Listen, he says, I've always encouraged her to be political. I may not be active, but let's say I'm concerned. He squints into the sun. Let's say maybe I'm just too old to encourage Joan Baez to be political, is really only to encourage Joan Baez to continue feeling things for her politics are still, as she said herself, all vague. Her approach is instinctive, pragmatic, not too far from that of any League of Women's Voters member. Frankly, I'm down on communism, is her latest word on the subject. On recent events in the pacifist movement, she has this to say: burning draft cards doesn't make sense, and burning themselves makes even less sense. When she was at Palo Alto High School and refused to leave the building during a bomb drill, she was not motivated by theory. She did it because it was the practical thing to do. I mean, it seemed to me this drill was impractical. All of these people thinking they could get into some kind of little shelter and be saved with canned water. She has made appearances for the Democratic administrations and is frequently quoted as saying, there has never been a good Republican folk singer. It is scarcely the dictation of new radicalism. Her concert programs included some of her thoughts about waiting on the eye of destruction, and her thoughts were these: my life is a crystal teardrop. There are snowflakes falling in the teardrop, and little figures trudging around in slow motion. If I were to look into the teardrop for the next million years, I might never find out who the people are and what they are doing. Sometimes I get lonesome for a storm, a full blown storm where everything changes. The sky goes through 4 days in 1 hour. The trees wail, little animals skitter in the mud, and everything gets dark and goes completely wild. But it's really God's playing the music of his favorite cathedral in heaven. Shattering stained glass, playing a gigantic organ, thundering on the keys, perfect for harmony, perfect joy. Although Miss Baez did not actually talk this way when she is kept from the typewriter. She does try, perhaps unconsciously, to hang on to the innocence and turbulence of the capacity for wonder, however ersatz or shallow, of her own or of anyone's adolescence. This openness, this vulnerability, is of course precisely the reason why she is able to come through. To all the young and lonely and inarticulate, to all those who suspect that no one else in the world understands about beauty and hurt and love and brotherhood. Perhaps because she is older now, Miss Baez is sometimes troubled that she means to a great many of her admirers everything that is beautiful and true. I'm not happy with my thinking about it, she says. Sometimes I tell myself, come on, Baez, you're just like everybody else. But then I'm not happy with that either. Not everybody else has the voice. Ira Sandpearl interrupts dotingly. Oh, it's all right to have the voice. The voice is all right. She breaks off and concentrates for a long while on the buckle of her shoe. So now the girl whose life is a crystal teardrop has her own place, a place where the sun shines and the ambiguities can be set aside for a little longer, a place where everyone can be warm and loving and share confidences. One day we went around the room and told a little about ourselves, she confides, and I discovered that, boy, I'd had it pretty easy. The late afternoon sun streaks the clean wooden floors, and the birds sing in the scrub oaks, and the beautiful children sit on their coats on the floor and listen to Ira Sandpearl. Are you a vegetarian, Ira? Someone asks idly. Yes, yes, I am. Tell them, Ira, Joan Baez says. It's nice. He leans back and looks towards the ceiling. I was in the Sierra once. He pauses, and Joan Baez smiles approvingly. I saw this magnificent tree growing out of a bare rock, thrusting itself, and I thought, all right, tree, if you want to live that much, all right, okay. I won't chop you. I won't eat you. The one thing we all have in common is that we want to live. But what about vegetables? A girl murmurs. Well, I realized, of course, that as long as I was in this flesh and this blood, I couldn't be perfectly nonviolent. It's getting late. 50 cents a piece is collected for the next day's lunch, and someone reads a request from the Monterey County Board of Supervisors that citizens fly American flags show that cooks, commies, and cowards do not represent our county. And someone else brings up the Vietnam Day Committee and a distant member who had visited Carmel. Marv's, an honest to God nonviolenter, Ira Sandpearl declares, a man of honesty and love. He said he's an anarchist, someone interjects doubtfully. Right, Ira Sandpile agrees. Absolutely. Would the VDC call Gandhi Borges? Oh, but they must know better. But they lead such Borgias lives themselves. That's so true, says the dreamy blond boy with the violet marble. You walk into their office, they're so unfriendly and cold. Everyone smiles lovingly at him. But now the sky outside is the color of marble. But they are all reluctant about gathering up their books and magazines and records, about finding their car keys and ending the day. And by the time they are ready to leave, Joan Baez is eating potato salad with her fingers from a bowl in the refrigerator, and everyone stays to share it. Just a little while longer where it's warm.